Hello, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And today we're going to talk about a very exciting topic, one of my favorites. It's about objective and universal moral values and duties. And more specifically, the source of our objective and universal moral values and duties. Stay tuned, we're about to begin. C.S. Lewis said, "You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general, just as you find out more about a man by listening to his conversation than by looking at a house he has built." Now, from this second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. In that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions that God is good. But do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care about how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. Many people argue that we have objective and universal moral values and duties. Moral values refer to whether something is good or bad, while moral duties refer to whether something is right or wrong, according to William Lane Craig. Rokeach says, to say a person has a value is to say he has an enduring belief that a specific mode of conduct or end state of existence is personally and socially preferable to alternative modes of conduct or end states of existence. To say moral values or duties are objective is to say they do not vary as a function of a person's opinions. They are the standards against which we judge practices, behaviors, and actions. For example, truth is an objective moral value whose meaning does not vary as a function of any one person or group of people. We assess whether someone is lying by matching his words or behaviors up against what we know is the truth. The golden rule is an objective moral duty whose meaning does not vary as a function of any person or group of people. We assess whether people follow the golden rule by whether and how their words or behaviors match up to a standard of benevolence. Moral universalism refers to a universal ethic that applies to all people, regardless of race, sex, religion, nationality, culture, or society. Some have argued that because objective moral values and duties transcend the cognitive limitations of particular individuals and are not restricted to the ethos of various cultures and eras, they must have been derived from a source that transcends the same boundaries. They argue that this source is an objective, universal, and intentional moral lawgiver. Along similar lines, Immanuel Kant said something referring to the metaphysical foundation of our moral duties. He says, everyone must admit that a law, if it is to be held morally, i.e., as the ground of an obligation, has to carry the absolute necessity with it, with the command, you ought not to lie, is valid not merely for human beings, as though other rational beings did not need to heed it, and likewise all other genuinely moral laws. Hence, the ground of the obligation here is to be sought not in the nature of the human being or the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but a priori solely in concepts of pure reason, and that in every other precept grounded on principles of mere experience, and even a precept that is universal in a certain aspect, insofar as it is supported in the smallest part on empirical grounds. Perhaps only as to its motive can be called a practical rule, but never a moral law. Thus, a metaphysics of morals is indispensably necessary. Others have made arguments suggesting objective or universal moral values and duties exist, yet they are not grounded in a transcendent moral lawgiver. In recent debate at the New York Academy of Sciences, Michael Shermer argued that for a naturalistic position in explaining objective morality, while Christopher Miller argued for a supernatural position. More specifically, Miller argued in favor of an omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient creator of the universe as a source of our moral grounding. Shermer argued in support of unguided evolutionary processes and the desire to survive and flourish. Which position is more valid? Are people from all parts of the globe bound by the same universal and objective moral values and duties, or are they only contingent? If universal and objective moral values and duties exist, are they grounded in a transcendent moral lawgiver, or are evolutionary adaptations sufficient to explain? So let's get into that a little bit. The very first question we're going to come up with is whether we have universal moral laws and duties. One of the reasons why I want to ask this question is because of the tendency in some places for people to focus more on moral relativism. DeMunich in 2015 cited two examples in which external observers failed to curb actions within isolated cultures due to their own desire to permit cultures to set their own rules. This is an example of moral relativism, despite the ethicality of the particular rules. He identified the white mutineers of the Bounty, who have occupied the British Pitcairn Islands near New Zealand for the past 200 years. They routinely break in their young girls, as young as 10 years old, by having sex with them. He also identified infanticides in the Amazon rainforest by tribes who force parents to kill their young babies and toddlers who are born with birth defects, stating that those humans lack souls. Outsiders have failed to step in and stop the practice under the belief that the tribes have rights to set their own rules. If we applied universal ethical guidelines to such situations, condemnation would more likely have occurred. Yet such condemnation, would it be fair? In other words, is humanity universally bound to the same sets of moral values and duties? Should we ensure that the International Bill of Human Rights by the United Nations is equally applied to all people on the globe? An equal application presents a norm that can be used to appeal against gross violations in human rights, and therefore this could be beneficial. Cross-cultural scholars in the last century made strong cases for either or both moral relativism, which acknowledges value differences between society, and moral universalism, which suggests certain moral values and duties are shared universally between all humans. I concur with them, and also that we should consider both frameworks together rather than only one or the other. Many scholars with similar ideas have built theories from the seminal works of Kluckhohn and Strodbeck, Rokeach, Hofstede, and Schwartz. In multiple studies of hundreds of samples in 82 countries and representing culturally diverse people of varying ages, genders, occupations, and geographies, Schwartz in 2012 drew a conclusion that he considered, quote, astonishing. After ranking 10 values in order of importance, results indicated universals in values. Respondents across all cultures ranked benevolence as the most important value, followed by universalism and self-direction. Benevolence refers to preserving and enhancing the welfare of those with whom one is in frequent personal contact, the in-group. Universalism refers to understanding, appreciation, tolerance, and protection for the welfare of all people and for nature. This contrasts with the in-group focus of benevolence. Self-direction refers to independent thought and action, choosing, creating, and exploring. Along similar lines, Kinnear, Kearns, and Doutharibes consulted the religious texts and sacred writings from 7 major world religions: Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Judaism, and Islam, to identify whether any universals could be found. They further consulted atheist and humanist organizations, along with the United Nations. They found that all emphasize 1, a commitment to something greater than oneself; 2, self-respect, but with humility, self-discipline, and acceptance of personal responsibility; 3, respect and caring for others, i.e. the golden rule; and 4, caring for other living things in the environment. Haidt and Joseph surveyed evolutionary theories about human and primate sociality, along with lists of virtues and taxonomies of morality from psychology and anthropology to moral concerns or virtues that were shared widely across cultures. They established 5 foundations of morality: care, harm, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, and purity, sanctity. Graham, Haidt, and Nozick identified political variations in the attention to the 5 foundations. People considered more liberal on the political spectrum were primarily concerned with care, harm, and fairness, reciprocity, while more conservative individuals drew more evenly across all 5 foundations. Taken together, these studies indicate similarity in the objective, self-transcendent foundations upon which to judge human behaviors and actions. Yet the question of grounding is outstanding. Since Darwin's time, we have been able to dial down on some of the causes of the variability in human populations due to studies on phenotypes, which are observable characteristics influenced by our environments, and genotypes, which is our genetic code. Evolutionary biologists and psychologists often make the cases that our moral behaviors can be explained as a function of humanity's adaptations to their environments over time. In other words, they make a descriptive case for morality, which is an attempt to describe as is conditions and practices and behaviors. The descriptive arguments in favor of evolution tend to focus on the idea that cultures adapted to their environments over time, both competing for resources and cooperating within in-groups to enhance their chances of survival. McKay and Whitehall delineate the adaptationist perspective on religion, which is a view that some of the religious byproducts we have observed, such as pro-social behaviors, may have become useful for the survival of individuals and groups as their cultures evolved. This approach helps to explain the growth of large-scale societies from smaller bands of hunters and gatherers, farmers, and local communities. They argue that small group psychology, in which families and small groups would hold cheaters and free riders accountable, would not work when societies grew into larger empires. In those cases, an external force was needed to monitor behaviors, which they proposed could be a god or gods. In other words, religion provided a needed system of external accountability. Illes, Arvey, and Bouchard noted that traits, work attitudes, values, and interests, and behaviors are heritable. In other words, genetic factors explain a certain portion of what people do or think. For example, the heritability of intelligence is between 0.6 and 0.8. If your parents are more intelligent, therefore you're more likely to be intelligent. The heritability of the 5-factor model of personality is 0.41 for emotional stability, 0.49 for extroversion, 0.45 for openness to experience, 0.35 for agreeableness, and 0.38 for conscientiousness. Empathy is a facet of agreeableness. The heritability of positive and negative emotionality is 0.3. The heritability, 0.43 and 4.7, between 0.43 and 4.7. The heritability of a person's attitude toward being the leader of a group is 0.41. In summary, people are born with certain predispositions that are likely to correspond to actions and decisions in their life. As noted, while biologists and psychologists have described descriptively our as-is genetic predispositions and behaviors, they cannot explain our should-be moral oughts and duties. It is a category error for them to define our moral prescriptions using a tool that is descriptive. An explanation of our moral foundations rests in the wheelhouse of philosophers. Osman and Wiegmann described a heated debate between a philosopher and two psychologists. Shaw, the philosopher, argued that the field of moral psychology lacks a moral compass and should acknowledge that, as a field, its dependency on psychological and biological facts makes it morally irrelevant and reveals nothing about the moral propositions of a normative nature. The two psychologists, Haidt and Pinker, who happened to be two atheists, replied that their research was never supposed to be understood as a normative guide, and that this should not only be obvious, but is also explicitly stated in their works. One of the psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, directed his challenger to a passage in his book where it says, philosophers typically distinguish between descriptive definitions of morality, which simply describe what people happen to think is moral, and normative definitions, which specify what is really and truly right, regardless of what anyone thinks. So far in this book, I have been entirely descriptive. Accordingly, next we'll turn to some theories from the the philosophical group. Consequentialism falls in the normative ethical teleological framework. According to this framework, consequences are what determine whether an action or life is moral. People who lean heavily on teleological ethics to make ethical decisions consider the morally correct action to be the one with the best consequences for the greatest number of people. Consequences take into account both actions and everything the actions caused. Happiness, which some refer to as well-being or pleasure, is often considered to be the ideal consequence. So some adherents use this consequence as the one which grounds moral decisions. Consequentialism focuses on moral reasoning. A form of teleological ethics is utilitarianism, which has been interpreted to mean the ends justifies the means. One problem with consequentialism relates to the fallibility of the evaluators. In Rawls' theory of justice, he states that each society sets its own moral standards. To set the standards, he argues that each society requires a certain set of initial conditions, which include rational actors and mutually disinterested parties. Repeat that, rational actors and mutually disinterested parties. Yet human nature is often in opposition to these rather strict, somewhat extreme conditions. Behavioral economists have found that people are often predictably irrational, while agency theory has often been drawn upon to make a strong case demonstrating that people act in their own self-interest. Please see Dan Ariely's work for the former. Cross-cultural scholars who study values have found that humans don't always act in rational ways, and rationality is subjectively defined and becomes problematic in cases of uncertainty. Rational or optimal decisions require that all alternatives to a problem are perceived by the problem solver, and in organizations, that is rarely the case. So, another shortcoming relates to the formulation of the greater good. If greater good is to be meaningful in the formulation of a criterion of morality, three conditions must be fulfilled, according to Grissage. 1, good must have a single meaning. 2, what is good in this unique sense must be measurable. And 3, the result of the measurement must settle moral issues, either directly or indirectly. Clearly, the necessary meaning of good cannot be specified in moral terms. What Rawls sets of utilitarianism is true of all consequentialism. Its point is to define good independently and right, and to define right in terms of good. And in general, consequentialists see the requirement and try to meet it. If consequentialists said that ethical considerations determine what a good consequence is, they would either be going in a circle or setting off an infinite regress. Accordingly, while consequentialism may be of some value in making ethical decisions, claiming consequentialism establishes grounding for our objective moral values and duties is erroneous. Another theory comes from the idea of deontological ethics. The influential German philosopher Immanuel Kant popularized the deontological view, which states that people should follow universal rules and norms on what ought to be followed. In his view, reason serves as a guide towards an action that fulfills what he labeled as the categorical imperative. An action performed out of duty is one of moral character. Kant's categorical imperative states that people should act according only to that maxim by which one can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. People are the ends, not the means to the ends, and valued equally. Deontology necessarily presupposes a rule-setting authority. According to Van Severen, morality is a matter of finding the right rule. It is not affected by desire, weakness of will, or laziness. A moral rule is followed as a duty, although it needs to be backed up by authority. Some have argued that the authority is either an implicit social contract, a democratic government, or God, such as Holyoake and Powell in 2016. But if we have universal moral duties that transcend all people, eras, and types of government, it follows that the moral lawgiver must also transcend people and eras. Claiming we have implicit social contracts does not eliminate the need for a moral lawgiver who established this social contract with all of humanity. Craig makes the argument that if objective moral values and duties exist, God exists. He states, there must be an infinite mind who is the architect of nature and whose moral purpose man and universe are gradually fulfilling, end quote. Given our universal moral values of benevolence and universalism and our universal moral duties to follow the golden rule, one could make the argument that the infinite eternal mind is the standard of goodness against which moral actions are measured. So the next point I'd like to make is deontological decisions contrast teleological decisions in that the latter are slower, based on more difficult and reflective rational reasoning, according to Holyoake and Powell. Cohen and Ahn note that people draw from both rational reasoning and intuitive emotions when making ethical decisions. So sometimes these conflicting processes compete. The authors use subjective utilitarian theory, which suggests that one's personal values of items in a moral judgment dilemma are weighed, and the highest values correspond to the difficulty of the decision in a variety of scenarios in different visual formats and with some time pressure. Conway and Goransky in 2013 conducted 3 studies finding variations between deontological and utilitarian inclinations. Deontological inclinations were related to empathetic concern, religiosity, and perspective taking, while utilitarian inclinations were related to the need for cognition. They further found that cognitive load reduced utilitarian inclinations, while manipulations that enhanced empathy increased deontological inclinations. Researchers have also distinguished utilitarian judgments from deontological judgments by distinguishing utilitarian decisions as those where one must cause harm to maximize outcomes, while deontological decisions are those that reject harm. This is often explained using the trolley dilemma, which gives the decision maker a choice based on the hypothetical story of an observer watching a train pass by. The observer sees that if the train continues down the track, it will hit 5 innocent people. The observer can save the 5 people if he stops the train, but to stop the train, the observer will need to push an innocent man in front of it. The deontologist would choose not to push the man, while the utilitarian would choose to push one person to save 5. One criticism of deontology occurs when moral duties conflict. For example, our basic human rights to life, liberty, truth, and justice may conflict. Kant considered each as independent, yet sometimes they conflict when seeking the high moral ground. For example, in Nazi Germany in the 1940s, a person hiding a family of Jewish people in his house likely desired justice and the protection of their lives and liberty. If Nazi guards showed up and asked whether he was hiding any Jews, he would need to lie to them so the family remains protected. Using the Kantian perspective would suggest the man has a moral duty to tell the truth. A different interpretation of deontology would suggest the duty should be considered collectively and weighted, depending on the context of the situation. Given varying contexts, values, and situations, forcing a dichotomy between deontological and teleological decisions using unrealistic trolley dilemmas and the like seems restrictive. One might instead consider a process. Zolo, Pellegrini, and Ciaupi in 2017 identified the importance of bridging the gap between intuitive and emotional processes, or moral intuitions, with conscious and rational processes, or moral reasoning, to explain ethical decision-making. They related moral intuitions to deontological ethics and moral reasoning to teleological ethics. The authors used an influential Christian moral social doctrine, synderesis, to bridge this gap. Synderesis is an innate human habit that fosters moral judgment and triggers the virtue of practical reason. It is the correct habit that regulates intuition due to its innate nature, and is present in every individual. Thomas Aquinas referred to synderesis as the law of our mind, which is an awareness or understanding of the principles of human actions. Practical reasoning moves one from awareness of the principles to conclusions on actions or decisions. Conscience then forms a judgment on whether the actions or decisions are in alignment with one's moral nature, whether they are right or wrong. If we consider this process and acknowledge the presence of synderesis and conscience, one might question the utility of any descriptive explanation offered through unguided evolution. One might instead favor the source of prescriptive moral duties, which is transcendent to all of humanity. Accordingly, I offer the following moral argument. 1, if humanity has universal, objective moral values and obligations to do what's right, there must be a universal source of righteousness that transcends generations. 2, humanity has universal, objective moral values and obligations to do what's right. 3, there is a universal source of righteousness, God. In a longitudinal study of world values, Ron Engelhardt identified trends away from traditional religious views towards secularization and rationality. These trends have manifested in a shift in views favoring naturalism and moral relativism, which is evidenced in university classrooms and academic scholarship. The intention of this video was to question the merit of cultural shifts away from supernatural foundations and explanations by examining and synthesizing the extant literature on moral universalism. I sought to understand whether people from all parts of the globe are bound by the same universal and objective moral values and duties, and whether our morality is only culturally contingent. The evidence presented suggests our morality is a blend of both relative and universal objective values. While scholars such as Gert Hofstede have provided strong evidence of variations between cultures in as-is values or practices, scholars such as those in the Globe study have provided evidence of both as-is and higher level should-be values. And in all cases, looking at humane orientation, the should-be values are higher than the as-is values in every country. Combined with results from other global studies led by Shalom Schwartz and Kinnear and colleagues, we have striking evidence suggesting humanity has certain moral imperatives. All humans, no matter the country, ethnicity, age, or gender, share the universal moral duty to strive for benevolence and universalism. These findings support the assertion that we have a conscience and a moral compass which direct us to goodness. It follows that the source of our conscience is a benevolent, transcendent moral lawgiver. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul stated the following in Romans 2:15. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Philosophers, evolutionary biologists, and psychologists have offered other explanations of our objective moral values and duties, which are captured in either evolutionary adaptations or normative moral theories. Rather than thinking these explanations are at odds with one another, falling into the modern debate trap that pits science against religion, one might posit a process-based view using synderesis, reasoning, and conscience. Evolutionary adaptations may have been guided by a divine moral lawgiver who stacked the deck in favor of selflessness and humility over selfishness, ego, and coopetition, which is the combination of competition and cooperation. Evolution offers an explanation of the as-is predispositions in humans that make more or less probable various behaviors. Evolution does not offer explanations of our moral duties or the prescriptions under which we have been universally guided. Philosophers initiated explanations of our moral duties using the normative, moral, deontological, and teleological frameworks, which has been studied in recent years in a variety of disciplines, using various lenses and interpretations. While both frameworks are useful in understanding the ways we make ethical decisions, only the deontological framework should be used to understand the source of our moral grounding. The teleological framework, which sets a goal of something considered good, such as well-being, while simultaneously saying an ethical decision that maximizes the goal is good, is circular. We should instead identify the source of our moral grounding using deontology, which necessitates a moral lawgiver who transcends cultures and people. I want to thank you for coming by today. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends, and come by again. Bye-bye.